everyone. So in this video we are going to go over the PowerPoint on Chapter 1, the pre-writing process. Now, when you saw the title of that PowerPoint, the pre-writing process, you may have thought to yourself, hey, didn't we go over a PowerPoint earlier in the course on pre-writing? And you're right, we did. However, that first PowerPoint on pre-writing was really about pre-writing in general, the kinds of strategies that you would use to pre-write no matter what the writing situation was. Here in Chapter 1, we are going to take those pre-writing techniques and what we learned about thesis statements and apply them directly to literary essays, right? Okay. So in this chapter, we are going to review audience awareness, what our purpose is in writing. We're going to talk about the key steps in critical reading. We are going to talk about 4 main ways that you can do pre-writing exercises. We're going to take another look at theme and thesis and how those two are connected and how we can develop them for a literary essay. And then we're going to talk more about thesis statements and looking at what kind are effective and which kind aren't so effective. So, we've already talked about audience, who your readers are, when we discussed the rhetorical situation earlier in the course. And if you remember, the rhetorical situation is topic, angle, purpose, audience, and then context and tone, right? So we already have talked about why it's important to consider who your readers are, no matter what you're writing. Whether it's a literary essay, or a research paper, or a memo, or an email, right? You should always think about who your readers are. So, you don't know everything about them, but in this case, if you're writing a literary essay for a class, you can assume a few things about those readers. First, you can assume that they have already read the literary piece that your essay is discussing. Just assume that they have. You can also assume that your readers are all college educated or in the process of becoming college educated, that they are all professionals in some capacity, right? So you are free to use vocabulary that college level students would understand. You can be on the more formal side, but you don't have to be stuffy formal. But just thinking about who your readers are your classmates. It's not just me, okay? So your readers are your classmates. They're your equals, and they have, so that means you guys have some common ground already, okay? We also talked with the rhetorical situation about purpose, right? Why are you writing? And every kind of writing has a purpose. Even a grocery list, right? There's a purpose behind that. An email, there's a purpose behind it. A memo, there's a purpose behind it. A write-up of how a procedure is supposed to be done. There's a purpose behind it, right? That purpose affects your whole approach to how you write that piece, or at least it should. Your purpose and your audience together shape how you should write something, okay? And in terms of this literary essay, your reason for writing it is not because your teacher is making you, even though that is the obvious answer. That's not very helpful. It might be the truth, but you need to think outside of the context of the assignment and then figure out what your purpose is. And there are several reasons why we might be writing something. We might be writing something to simply express ourselves. That's not often going to be the case in academics and professional writing. That's usually a little more on the personal side. You might have some college classes where you are given an assignment and it's really more about expressing yourself. But that's typically not very common in academics or the professional world. But it is a possibility. Another possibility is to entertain. Perhaps the reason you're writing something is you want to make people laugh. Or maybe you want to scare them. But entertainment is definitely a reason for writing. The two most common reasons, though, in academics and the professional world is to inform and to persuade. So if you are writing to inform your readers, that's exactly what it sounds like. Whatever you're writing about, you are sharing information with them. If you are writing to persuade, that means you are trying to convince them of something. You have a point of view. You have an opinion. And you are trying to convince your readers to agree with you. And it can be something very simple to something that's a very big, hot topic issue. And anything in between. Okay? So, some examples of what you would do in a literary capacity with each of those types of purposes. You know, if you were writing to express yourself, and the literary work you're dealing with is Evelyn, you could write down your feelings about Evelyn in a journal entry or in a brief note to a close friend. You could talk about whether or not you sympathize with Evelyn. Do you pity her? Does she irritate you or make you angry? Those would be like a reader response, right? Just sort of the early stages of becoming familiar with a piece, starting to think about it, starting to interact with it. But then we also have, you might be informing people. So you are simply giving information. So one thing that you might be asked to do would be to write a brief summary of Evelyn for a fellow student who has not read the story and wants to know if the story is worth reading. You might also write what would be a slightly longer summary for your instructor who has already read the story, who wants to know if you've grasped the important points. So if you're giving a brief summary to someone who has not read the story and they just want to know if it seems interesting, if it seems like something they would want to read, what you include in that small summary will be different than what you would include in the summary to your instructor when you're trying to show that you have fully understood the story, right? Which one do you think would be easier to write? I'm not so sure. Obviously, if there was a lot of confusing parts to the story, the summary for your instructor might be difficult. If the whole purpose is to show that you fully grasped everything, if you haven't grasped everything, then that's going to be a problem. But you'd think that writing the shorter summary to your friend would be easy, but it's not, because you have to pick and choose exactly what you're going to say, because you don't want to give too much away. They haven't read it yet. And the whole reason they're asking you to tell them about it is to see if they might want to read it. And if you give them too much information, they're going to feel like they already know everything. So why read it now? And that's not easy to do. It's not easy to pull back and edit what we share. But that would be one way that you might be informing someone when you're writing a literary essay. We're going to skip over entertain. I want to talk about persuade, the last one. So, another reason why you might be writing is to persuade. So, this is where you are trying to get the reader to agree with your opinion, your point of view. So one assignment that you could get that would be a persuasive endeavor would be the author tells us, James Joyce tells us, that Evelyn held 2 letters in her lap, but we don't know their contents. Write your version of one of them. That could be something that you were asked to do, and that would be persuasive, because you'd basically be trying to convince the reader that the version that you're writing is realistic, really could be one of the letters that she was holding. Try to construe from evidence in the story what Evelyn would have said to convince her father or her brother that she had good reasons for going away with Frank. That would be persuasive. Anything where you're trying to pose a possibility. Anytime you are saying, here's what I think is going on, or here's what I think happened, or would happen, and you're using evidence from the story, you are trying to convince your readers. You're trying to persuade them. If you are saying, here is what I think is the theme based on this, this, and this, you're trying to convince us that you're correct. It's persuasion. This is the most common form of academic writing and professional writing, followed closely by to inform. So normally we're trying to persuade, but a lot of times we are also trying to inform. And those are the two biggest reasons, the two biggest purposes behind academic and professional writing. Alright, so we've thought about who our readers are, we've thought about why we're writing, what our purpose is. Now you have to ask yourself, what do I write about? What ideas should I use? What should actually go into this paper? What should I write about? And you have to learn the right questions to ask yourself while you're reading, and then after you've read, going back and looking over the story again. You want to examine the work carefully, and you want to think critically about each component, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to read and think critically while you're reading something, or while you're trying to come up with your topic and your supporting evidence. So critical reading and thinking involves several overlapping procedures. We've got analysis, inference, synthesis, and evaluation. And one thing to keep in mind is when we say critical reading or critical thinking, we're not talking about being disapproving or finding the fault, finding what's wrong. Critical means thorough, thoughtful, inquisitive, logically demanding. When I say think critically about the story, I'm not saying find the things that are wrong with it. Thinking critically about a story means examining every part closely, thoroughly, asking questions, being inquisitive, being thoughtful about it, not just taking things at face value, digging a little deeper. That's critical thinking and reading. So, when you are using critical reading and critical thinking skills, you want to discover meanings and relationships that you would otherwise miss if you're just doing a superficial reading. And this is why sometimes two people can read the same thing. And this has already happened in the weekly discussions with the poems. You guys can read the same thing, and for whatever reason, some students have the critical reading skills in play and others don't. And then the next week it'll be a different poem on a different subject matter, and it'll like flip-flop. So where our interests are, and what, you might also just have been having a really busy week and you just didn't have the time to use those critical thinking and reading skills in that moment, and then it's just a superficial reading. And it's okay if sometimes things get a superficial reading from you. What's most important is that you know the difference between a superficial reading and a critical reading, and you know how to do a critical reading if needed, right? But we want to go beyond that superficial reading. We want to think more critically about the things we're reading, ask those questions, be thorough, and be logically demanding about it. All right. So those 4 overlapping procedures with critical reading and critical thinking. We start with analysis. Analysis is examining the parts of a work to understand how they work as a whole. So examining each part to show how it works as a whole. So some examples of questions that would invite analysis. What is the central conflict of the story? We're having to look at parts. Does the story contain any secondary conflicts? You know, if you're looking at the subplots, that's going to start to help you look at the different parts of the story. How do they relate to the main conflict? So asking yourself these questions will help you towards analysis. Inference. Inference is where we start to draw conclusions about the piece based on our analysis. So in the analysis, we looked at all the parts to see how they function together as a whole. And now in inference, we're going to start making some conclusions, drawing some conclusions. When you infer, you explore the implications of various elements. So you're looking at plot, characterization, structure, tone, etc. And you interpret their meaning. You're making an inference. So some questions that require inference are, who is the main character? Does this person's character change during the course of the story? Do you feel sympathetic towards the main character? What sort of person is she or he? Those will have you start to draw conclusions on the work, right? Then we also have synthesis. This is where you're taking your analysis and your inferences and putting them together to sort of form a new or more informed understanding of the work. You create this new understanding by making connections, identifying patterns, drawing conclusions, and one question that has you use synthesis is, what is the theme of the story? Can you state it in a single sentence? Once you're able to do that, you have achieved synthesis. You've taken your analysis and your inference and put them together. You've synthesized all of that. And now we have a new, deeper understanding of the piece. And the 4th step in critical reading and thinking is evaluation. This is where you're going to defend the judgments that you've made about a piece, about its meaning, its significance, its quality. So some evaluation questions are, which of the stories conveys the nature of relationships and marriage most effectively? Why? Or which of the poems conveys the horrors of war most effectively? Why? So now you're taking analysis, inference, and synthesis, and now you're making a judgment. Now you're going to a whole new level with it. And a lot of times there is some comparison involved. So it's not just one story or poem, you're looking at multiple. So that requires a measure of evaluation. So these are all steps that you need to take for critical reading and critical thinking. So you read critically to derive meaning from the work. And you have to continue to think critically to discover ideas to write about. And that discovery process is what we call invention, right? And that's where the pre-writing techniques come into play. So I want to take just a couple moments to look at how we can apply those pre-writing techniques we've already discussed and use them in the context of coming up with ideas for a literary essay. So one thing that you can do is self-question, right? So as you're reading and after you read, ask yourself all kinds of questions. Like for Eveline, for example, on slide 12, there's a bunch of questions that you could ask. Like, what is her home life like? How does she expect her new life to be different from her old one? Why is the word dust mentioned so often? What sort of person is her father? What kind of bad way is he in on Saturday nights? How does Evelyn feel about her dead mother? What is her duty to herself? Does she really believe that she has a right to happiness? Why or why not? Has Evelyn romanticized Frank in any way? Is her father's objection to him valid in any way? Do you think Evelyn made the right choice? Why or why not? So just continually asking yourself questions about the text that you're reading can help you come up with ideas. Right? You can also do a directed free write. We can think of a question. Maybe one is given to you, or you can just think of a question of your own that you have about the story. Maybe towards the end, you thought, why does she stay? Why does Evelyn stay with her abusive father? Well, let's free write about it. Okay? Remember, free write, 10 to 15 minutes, non-stop. Just get all your ideas out. After the timer goes off, then you're going to read over everything that you wrote. And one thing you could do is you could start to sort of parse out the kind of ideas that you jotted down. So you might underline anything that you wrote that might serve as the focus for a paper. Anything that is a big enough idea, big enough topic that you could devote a whole paper to it. Right? Put stars or asterisks in the margin next to anything you wrote down that you think would end up being good to support, like you referred to a part of the story or something that she said or something that her father said, and you're like, oh, that's going to help me prove something. Put a star next to it, right? Then look at the statements, or at least one of the statements that you underlined. Remember, we underlined anything that might serve as the focus for a whole paper. So anything that you underlined, you can do it with all of them or just the one that piques your interest the most, and then do another free write with that statement as your prompt, right? And you can see there's an example in the textbook on page 12 if you want to see that directed free write. Another thing, obviously, that we can do is what we call problem solving. All right? So this basically has to do with you thinking about some part of the story that you need to understand better and pose a problem to yourself, right? So the problem is about the ending, let's say. So explain the ending of the story so that it is understandable and believable. Because you don't know why she stays. You don't get it. So you have to pose that as a problem. The problem is, why did she stay? Let's figure out some solutions. And then you start asking yourself more questions. Why does she refuse to leave her narrow life with her father? Is there anything about the way she was brought up that makes this action seem reasonable or perhaps inevitable? Would her life have been different if she had been born male instead of female? Does her religion have any bearing on her decision? Ask yourself those questions in regards to that problem, okay? Write down all your answers, anything you can think of to explain the original question. And then go back through your solutions, your answers. Does anything shed light on the story? Did that help you come up with a meaningful point that you could then develop into an essay? So use your own questions about the story to help propel you into an idea for the essay. And then, of course, we have our clustering. So on slide 15, you see a little example of clustering here. And the idea in the middle is, why does Evelyn decide to stay? And then we've got 5 ideas shooting off of that question. 5 possible answers shooting off of that question. And then for each of those 5 possible answers, we've got other ideas coming off. So again, clustering is a way of jotting down your ideas, just like free writing, just like brainstorming and listing, except it's in a visual form, and you're already in the process of grouping ideas together. Sometimes I do a directed free write or a brainstorm and just listing things, and then I cluster what I've already jotted down, because then it gives me the visual of how things are grouped, how my ideas are related. Some people work differently, but these are all different ways that you could use those pre-writing techniques and use questions. Question yourself, question the story to help come up with an idea for the essay. Then you have to ask yourself, what points should I make? Right? I have this idea. The point that you're trying to make will be your thesis statement, will be the overall claim that you're trying to make. It's the controlling idea for your paper. It will also help you discover the evidence, the support that you want to use to prove your claim, your interpretation, or your solution to that problem you came up with. And you want to come up with a thesis statement that relates some aspect, like the point of the thesis statement has to relate to some aspect of the work and its overall meaning. It has to involve the theme in some way. Your thesis statement does. At least that's a good bet that you're headed in the right direction with the thesis statement. A lot of these questions that we were looking at in the pre-writing activities, they kind of looked at character and plot and things like that, but looking just at character and plot is not going to produce a very critical paper. It is not going to take it to the next level. You need to go beyond that and make sure that your essay says something about the story itself. You have to make sure that your analysis relates to the theme. Okay? And we've already talked about theme. How do you figure out theme on your own? How do you state the theme in your own words? Sometimes you have something in mind, but you can't find the right words unless it's like a cliche. For example, if you read Eveline, you have this idea rolling around in your head, and it's like, I know what the theme is, but I can't quite put it into words. It's like it's on the tip of my tongue. You can use a cliche to start, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, right? And that's what it is. She chooses the devil she knows, that she's comfortable with, as opposed to the devil she doesn't know, the unknown, the scary. But they're both devils. Right? But then you got to take that a step further. At least that gets your thought down, and you now have a place to sort of start from, but you don't want to leave it at a cliche. You need to go back, and you need to make sure that it clearly states a claim. So something like, in Eveline, Joyce focuses on the painful choices a young woman faces concerning her desire for a better life, her duty to her family, and her fear of leaving home. That's really what the story is about. You just have to work your way to it if you're having difficulty putting that into words to start with. But you have to start somewhere, so if you start with that cliche, that's okay. You can continually come back to it and refine it as you continue pre-writing, as you continue drafting, and get it where it needs to be. But I want to talk about our rules of thesis statements, what we've learned so far. Remember that a good thesis statement is a complete sentence, clearly conveys the point that you plan on explaining or supporting in your essay. That's the thesis statement, remember? So I want you to notice some differences here between, if someone asks you what your thesis is for a literary essay on Eveline, your answer should not be a characterization of Eveline, because that's a topic. That is not a thesis statement. Not only is it not a complete sentence, but it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't make a claim of any sort. So how about something like Joyce's, so I'm going to ask you, what's your thesis statement for your literary essay on Eveline? And you could say, Joyce's characterization of Eveline as a dutiful daughter enables us to discover why she makes her strange decision at the end. So your problem was, why does she stay? Why doesn't she go with Frank? That was the problem. We developed that, and now we have realized that if we pay attention to how she's characterized as a dutiful daughter, it's really not much of a surprise that she stays, right? So now we've taken that topic and turned it into an actual thesis statement. Same thing here, dust as a symbol in Eveline. That is not a thesis statement. That's a topic. You got to take that beyond just what are you writing about. What is your claim? What is the main controlling idea in your essay? Oh, well that would be Joyce's use of dust as a controlling symbol in Eveline reinforces our understanding of this young woman's dreary, suffocating, arid life. Oh, I'm interested to read that now. I want to see how you're going to prove that. Alright. You remember you also want the thesis to be broad enough to include all the main ideas that you're going to cover in the essay, but also narrow enough to make a precise statement about your point. So, going back to the idea of characterization, it would be way too broad of a statement to say, have our thesis statement be, Joyce's characterization of Eveline is extremely well drawn. No, that's too broad, and it doesn't really tell us anything that you're going to do in the essay. I still have no idea where you're taking that. So we could say, Eveline's Catholic upbringing as a dutiful daughter makes impossible her hopes for a happier life. Okay. Now I know you're going to be looking at the Catholic religion and her upbringing as a dutiful daughter, how those work together to inform the ending. Or you could say, if Eveline had been born male instead of female, she might have escaped her unhappy home life, as her brother did. So now we're looking at the gender aspect, right? Or Eveline, trapped like a helpless animal by her promise to her dying mother, is morally unable to break her vow and flee her miserable home to seek a new life for herself. Alright, so now we're looking at how she's like a trapped animal because of the promise she made. Or, having been thoroughly beaten down by her brutal, domineering father, Eveline lacks the self-confidence to flee in search of her own life. So that also gives me a very specific indication of what you would be doing in that essay. All four of those good options all have to do with how Eveline is characterized. But each one of them takes a specific route with how she's characterized. And I get a very clear idea of what the rest of the essay will be doing. Way better than the original possibility of a thesis statement, which was Joyce's characterization of Eveline is well drawn. That doesn't tell me anything. I have no idea what you're doing. So, what part of her characterization are you going to focus on? And then that can lead you to a more focused thesis statement that lets me know exactly what's happening. Alright, so again, just thinking about the rhetorical situation, who's reading, why are we writing, using the pre-writing strategies to help us think critically and read critically. Also using those pre-writing strategies for invention to help us come up with ideas, to help us come up with a topic to write about. And remember that when you get to making a thesis statement, that it needs to somehow relate to the theme of the story, because that takes you to that next level. Then it's no longer just analysis or inference. Now we're starting with synthesis. And remember the rules of thesis statements. When you're coming to a literary essay, you definitely want to make sure that you are making a very clear point and that it is something that you are trying to convince us of. Okay? Alright, if you have any questions about Chapter 1, let me know. Otherwise, you can move on to Chapter 2.